Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Hiott. I'm going to talk about phenomenological heritage, cities as lived experiences. The basic idea is that cities are not only material, but they're also phenomenological. So I introduced this idea of phenomenological heritage. It's based on a master I did for the UNESCO World Heritage Program. I'm introducing the idea of phenomenological heritage and also weighability or navigability. Weighability is the overall process of how we move through time and space. I'm going to focus on cities here. And the navigability would be how we actually visualize it, make a model of it, map it, create some kind of external representation. We don't really take phenomenological heritage, and by that I mean the lived experience that is different for each of us depending on our developmental trajectory and our embodied sensuality. We don't take that into consideration much, at least not explicitly. We haven't tried to externally represent it and model it when it comes to cities. I look at things like walkability and the 15-minute city and expand them through this framework of waymaking, which is part of my philosophical work, an approach to understanding our experience across scales and species. And as I'll mostly be talking about humans and cities in this talk, I also want you to know that part of the motivation is that we can also use this same framework to think about other beings like plants and animals and all the birds and insects and other amazing creatures that are making their way through the cities and that matter for the cities when we talk about something like livability. We can think of mind as movement in cities, but we also have to think about it not only in physical and geographical space, but also through mental spaces and spaces we don't typically think of as part of what we imagine when we imagine what a city is, but that they are just as important. Emotional spaces, spaces of what we might think of as intangible heritage as well. So, waymaking is dynamic and shared and has no center, start, or end. But we can start to share and represent this externally as what I call navigability. So you have waymaking and weighability, and then when we try to really visualize it and use examples of it, we talk about it as navigability. If we look at which landscape we're talking about, so to speak, are we talking about a traditionally geographical space like a park, or how we move through a city in the green space, or are we thinking more of this developmental heritage that can be emotional, that can be conceptual, that is linguistic, all of those spaces? And when we look at those spaces, we need to set the parameters. What are we thinking about? What are we looking at? We're looking at, for example, the statistical regularities of how accessible this area is if you speak a certain language. So that would be a sort of linguistic space. But also in terms of economics or certain perceptions relative to other areas of our inheritance that may or may not make us feel welcome within an area. All of that is part of the phenomenological heritage, which can never, of course, be expressed directly in any kind of representation or model, but we can make models and representations based on different parts of this. And these are what I mean by navigabilities. Navigabilities are then the trajectories afforded to a particular body as assessed by that body or by another through a particular landscape, whereby a landscape is defined as a regularized encounter. So I was talking about these many different landscapes, like the conceptual, the linguistic, the emotional. All of those are landscapes that we are going to look at as represented. So we're going to represent them through particular regularities that they have. So even though lived experience is dynamic and ongoing and cannot be fully represented, we can't like talk about it or write about it or model it in full ever because it's changing and always moving and different for all of us. But we can create representations or snapshots of this ongoing process so as to try and communicate about its regularities. I mean, this is what we do all the time in different ways, whether it's art, movies, music, or more scientific senses when we try to create models or theories in a way where you're trying to externally represent what we want to understand as a shared process, but that is experienced differently for each of us. Even though we do share it, it is a shared space. These navigabilities that we model or represent, these are understood as nested, such that any assessment of navigability must be understood as only one scale of what could be measured or can be measured from all these many other nested layers, from all of these other positions, from your position, my position, everyone else's position. And landscape is any regularized encounter. So even this gym is a landscape. It's a part of space that can be regularized. And by regularized, I mean, we could actually break it up into statistical regularities that are mostly present most of the time for most people who go there, But then we can also do assessments from the individual perspective that would differ, of course, according to each person. If you had a hurt knee, you're going to have a very different experience of what's possible, what's afforded to you in that space. And we can really do this with any space. It could be the space of conversation, for example, or the space of something like a discipline that we encounter, or a study area, or the accessibility of a particular economic bracket relative to when we go shopping. A lot of the data that we already use and gather could be thought of in a different way if we began to understand these as landscapes. And again, these are just ways of taking kind of a snapshot or a look at this ongoing process that can never be fully externally represented. So phenomenological comes from this tradition of Husserl, Merleau-Ponty. Strauss is very important to me. But I also frame it in a wider sense. I think of it a lot as James and just a bare relation of witness. It's embodied, it's shared experience that can be studied scientifically. And in other work that I do, I try to widen this idea of phenomenology and what it's really meant. I include things other people might call post-phenomenology. And I also look at other sources like W.E.B. Du Bois and other writers who talk about something like double consciousness, for example. I'm not going to go into all that here. For short, we can just think of phenomenological as embodied lived experiences. And then heritage is both shared and individual. We have lots of ways of addressing it as shared, but each human is a part of a trajectory of heritage that is also specific to them. Our experience of a city cannot be separated from this individual trajectory. So the very word heritage points to this and is often what is used to distinguish it from history. So basically what I mean by phenomenological heritage is heritage as lived experience. You can think about this yourself. When you make your way through a city, is the action physical, mental, emotional, individual, social? Of course, it's all of these and never only one of them. So I want to rethink cities through the trajectories of phenomenological affordance. And the livable city would be this dynamical system of nested spaces that would support diverse trajectories that are geographical, but also these ones that are lived experience, emotional, mental, social, and how accessible our different ways of being in the world are to one another. It doesn't mean that we'll ever fully embody another person in their trajectory, but how easy is it for us to share these and to feel that we can share them? Often we don't discuss or model these phenomenological trajectories. The living heritage of individual lives is not often considered, but that is what the livability of a city really is at its most foundational part. And though there are wonderful new metrics like walkability in the 15-minute city, when we think about livability, I still feel there's something missing. And that is this individual trajectory, this way that as I walk through the city, depending on all my experiences that have come before and the way that I've been seen by all people around me, I have a different experience of that city. And of course, all these trajectories and navigabilities overlap, but they're also unique in each shared space. So one term that's often used when we talk about urban planning is that of livability, which is loosely defined as a city's overall impact on the well-being of its community. So it's the quality of living it offers. And over the last decade, rather than focusing on aspects such as traffic patterns and high-rise space, there's been this great new focus on the people that live in the city and what improves their quality of life. Architect John Gell, for example, has developed criteria for assessing the livability of a city that includes something like high-quality facades, low buildings, liveliness. These are more human-focused, and they prioritize pedestrianism. And this has led to a focus on assessing cities with high levels of walkability, for example. So livability and walkability have been connected. And while these are all very positive moves, there are still some important elements missing, as I've hinted to. First, that the effect of any city space is not only one that's geographical. So liveliness and low buildings may be good, but they're not the only factors in terms of what makes a city livable for a person who's in it. There's also mental and emotional affordances, which of course are not separate from the geographies that we build. I mean, different kinds of ways of building buildings have different kinds of mental and emotional effect. However, even though those are shared, quite often there may be certain parts of the city that for certain people have very different affordances, even though all of these geographical features are the same. And that's tied to the heritage of that space and to the heritages of those who enter it or are broadly deemed the public. Cities are usually seen as material spaces, but they are also phenomenological. landscapes that, even while shared, are experienced in unique ways according to the developmental trajectory and embodied sensuality of the person encountering them. Matters of lived experience. Whatever the person encountering that city is bringing with them based on their development, and of course that development being based on a trajectory that extends beyond them and to their parents and ancestors and so on, but also just in their own lived experience, their lived life, everything that's been said to them, everything they've read, all that goes into the way we perceive the world, the way this or that cafe or this or that color or this or that avenue has a slightly different meaning or experiential feeling for each one of us, even though mostly the regularities are shared. So in these discussions, there's not the explicit acknowledgement of the fulcrum upon which this public quality of life rests, which is that of the individual phenomenological experience of it. So wayability and navigability expand walkability. Wayability is not only about how close things are to a person, it's also about the nearness of the conceptual, social, historical, and cultural trajectories, these cognitive affordances or intangible affordances. So wayabilities, which again can be visualized as navigabilities if we're going to actually create an external representation of them, are not only about how close something is to us geographically, but also mentally, socially, emotionally, and so on. So a livable city is a dynamic system of nested trajectories that supports diverse trajectories and instigates trajectorial communication toward new wayabilities. Why does it matter if we include phenomenological heritage? Because this is at the root of our primary challenges. And I mean that whether it's the cause of war and misunderstandings or the destruction of our environment, I really think our most basic challenges at the moment are matters of not taking our phenomenological heritage and that of all the others around us and the other beings into consideration, which doesn't mean we can ever fully represent that, but we can create these little snapshots, or we can make navigability visual at the same time that we realize that the lived experience is never able to be captured wholly. It can be in part shared and better understood. An example would just be a literal line of one's trajectory through geographical world. You could draw where you've been since you were born. That would be a geographical trajectory through time and space, and you could compare that to others. Where does it overlap? Where does it not? That's a kind of toy example, but it's a true example. We could all do that. And we could also do that in other spaces. We could do that in conceptual spaces, in economic spaces, once we set the parameters of what we're looking for, which would be either with economics, we could do it through something like salary or the ways that this is measured in socioeconomic data. We could also do it with emotions, because all emotions, something like sadness or joy, are are basically approximations of regularities that are shared. So we're never really able to use words or models to completely, fully represent what those are for each of us, because it's different. However, we could create some sort of parameters based on these generalized words like sad, melancholic. We could probably be a little more precise in terms of how, when we move through a particular city, for example, since that's what I'm focusing on here, how we feel. So we could do a qualitative and quantitative assessment of this through something like an app, just as you're moving through different parts of the city, how that city feels for you, what parts feel accessible emotionally or not, or just neutral. And of course, each of us, depending on how we're welcome or unwelcome in particular parts of the city, will have a different trajectory in that way. And this also could literally be represented, visualized as a line through emotional space if we have set those parameters. What I'm trying to do here is orient heritage as an important shaper of the future rather than something that's only in the past, and expand this term that is often used in, for example, in UNESCO, of intangible heritage to include these other navigabilities that I'm discussing here. These trajectories based on economics or ethnicity or different ways that we already compile data, which are already generalizations and lacking, and yet at the same time can begin to tell us a little something more about the phenomenological experience of a city as we move through it. And the hope is to offer wider inspiration for just what we think of as this term livability. Livability is a word that's used often when we think about urban planning, but we don't really take this phenomenological heritage into consideration. when we are talking about livability thus far. So here I want to open a way to envision cities as landscapes that aren't only geographical, but also developmental, cognitive, emotional, holding shared but also different affordances for those inhabiting them. And this might help us better observe the city as a multidimensional living system that requires phenomenological acknowledgement and trajectorial sharing. How many of those trajectories or navigabilities are shared or recognized by others? A park that's been built upon a former burial ground would likely have a very different phenomenology for those who once had their ancestors buried there, for example, even though the people using it might have absolutely no idea that it was ever used for such a thing. Or shopping in a new mall that's been built over what was once a family home would have a different phenomenology for that family than it would for the shoppers, who would probably never know that someone had lost their home for the building of that shopping mall. Something like even visiting a well-manicured park would have a different phenomenology for a person who has studied rewilding and loves insects. So how to account for all this plurality of heritage and city design and assessments of heritage and livability is definitely a big challenge, but that doesn't take away from the need for us to acknowledge this and to begin to have terms to talk about it and to look at ways to actually model these landscapes and look at ways of visualizing the different trajectories within them so that we can share and illustrate our different lived experiences of cities to one another in the same way that we might write books or draw diagrams or make art to share our experiences. We also need these sorts of terms and visualizations to help us better understand these navigabilities that we experience in both tangible and intangible parts of our city. So this is important for cities, but it's also important for heritage studies in general, especially as it relates to cities, because heritage has long been considered important in urban planning, but only recently have we really started to talk about what's intangible. The recognition of phenomenological heritage reminds us that each embodied position has affordances in various shared spaces that are experienced uniquely from that position. If we want to assess the affordances of a new neighborhood in a city or a new heritage site, we set certain parameters. And these are often made to be general, such as Carlos Moreno's 15-minute city in urban planning, which is, again, another wonderful idea and a metric that's now used to assess how easy it is to walk to a grocery store, for example, or a doctor. But again, going to these areas just because they're close in time and space in a geographical sense doesn't mean they're necessarily accessible from these other mental and emotional and more heritage-based trajectories. So perhaps for whatever reason, my skin color or my economic background or whatever, I would feel more or less comfortable in these spaces. And the fact that they're 15 minutes away doesn't change the nearness or closeness they might be to me in emotional space, in mental space, in my developmental space in terms of my heritage. So to have this metric of walking time, first of all, it excludes those who don't walk, because there are many other beings that we need to think about when we think about our cities, and also people who are in wheelchairs or who ride their bicycles, or these many, we can think of other different ways of mobility of humans, but also of other beings. So what if we had a term that was a little wider, like way-ability, that could be modeled as navigabilities, that we then don't have to think only about walking, and we also don't only have to think about these spaces as being geographical and topological only, that we could also think of them in what we now consider traditionally mental or emotional spaces. So rather than confining ourselves to matters of like literal walking time, we could use this wonderful model of Moreno, but expand it to these other landscapes and notice these other paths by which any city and any heritage site comes to be, the paths that are mental, emotional, physical, developmental, the ones linked to our intangible and tangible heritage, and depending upon how they are observed, are also going to create the future. So the visibility of those trajectories are also necessary to assess livability. And once we are attuned to acknowledge these phenomenological heritages, then we are in a stance to look at how this space might be seen from the perspective of different positions, from the immigrant or from the native or from forester's perspective, or that of a commuter or of a person who works in this particular job. Or so we can really start to look at this as a complex system and zoom in or out to different positions relative to the many different developmental trajectories that we have, and start to at least get a better view of the different ways there are of being in a city and navigating it, and how it can feel accessible on so many different levels. And these cognitive heritages or phenomenological heritages that haven't really been considered in assessments of livability would then begin to become more visible and help us to better shape our urban space and its health, sustainability, and livability. And that will give us just a better picture of what we're missing about one another's experience, because the patterns we notice are only as livable as they relate to each embodied experience. So livability would be a matter of navigability for each person, and what paths the city affords its citizens, and this in both tangible and intangible landscapes, if you use the UNESCO terminology, and how accessible phenomenological heritages are to one another. So how easy is it for us to become aware of a heritage with a markedly different navigability from our own? Where do they, perhaps they never cross, in which case that's would be a low livability for the city. But if they do cross and they offer ways to open up to one another and bridges towards one another over through these many different landscapes, then we have a more livable city where agency is afforded for the paths to connect and improve one another. And I should just say that by phenomenological heritage here, I do not mean the history of the study of phenomenology as a discipline within cities. I mean the study of the lived experience of the individuals as they encounter that city over space and time. In short, cities are not only material, but also phenomenological. They are lived experiences. In other words, our cities, even while we share them and most of the regularities overlap, we experience those in unique ways according to our own developmental trajectory and our own embodied sensuality. And this is true not only of humans, by the way, but also of plants and animals and insects, birds, all of these other beings which are part of the city and who also have trajectories that can be shared and should be shared. So right now, the terms and models we use to discuss livability of cities, such as walkability and the 15-minute city, do not adequately address or consider the fact that we all live a different phenomenological trajectory or navigability, even though we do share so many spaces together. Our lived experience of that is often very different. And to talk about livability of a city means we need to make some space to talk about this. So that's what this term phenomenological heritage and the weighability and the navigability are, hoping to address this blind spot. So the challenges that we face are really challenges that require us to think differently about our own phenomenology and how it's connected to that of all the other beings in the world. So in a way, can help us expand our own phenomenological responsibility and take other beings into consideration, because the city is its physical, conceptual, historical, and narrative trajectories. Paths of memory and afforded knowledges are different for each of us, and yet we often just think everyone's having the same experience as us, just because it's very hard not to assume that. But I think a term like phenomenological heritage, when it comes to how we experience and look at the way a city is created and developed, could be very helpful, even just in reminding us that there are always many other different ways, many different experiences that are possible in any space and that are happening in these many nested landscapes. So it's important also because developing a city is developing heritage, and heritage is developing the future. So when we design our cities, we really need to ask how we're connecting all these different possible trajectories, what navigabilities are being prioritized and made possible. And this can help us to look at cities in a different way and to begin to find ways in which cities themselves are paths for connecting across divides that have held us back before, and that are also connecting us with other beings in a way that's healthy for all of us. So this is a very generalized summary of the bigger topic that I'm working on. If you want to explore more, I have a lot of papers and things that you can find online, or you can look on my Love and Philosophy YouTube channel and watch some interviews there. But I'd also love to hear from you if you have some ideas about how this could be even more improved. Thank you very much.